You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. On December 10th, 2006, a slight man in his 20s with thick black hair stood shivering as he worked on the slaughterhouse floor at Quality Pork Processors in Austin, Minnesota. Machinery clanked in the background, and the metallic smell of fresh blood and acrid bleach hung in the air. The man, whose name was Javier, felt the freezing wind blow in from the loading docks and seep through the thin white lab coat he wore over his clothes. But Javier wasn't just cold. His muscles ached, he felt like he might have a fever, and his hands and feet tingled as if they were asleep. He hoped he wasn't coming down with the flu. He stomped his feet and tried to shake the tingling sensation out of his hands, but that didn't help. Javier's workstation was the last stop on a conveyor line that snaked its way through a large room. On this line, workers systematically carved up each hog carcass into roughly 150 pounds of pork, sausage, bacon, and other cuts of meat. Javier stood shoulder to shoulder at a long table with two other workers. A young woman named Maria was to his right, and on his left was an older man named Carlos. And the three of them, their job was to process the pigs' heads. All three of them wore rubber boots and safety glasses, and their lab coats were pretty much always stained with blood and gore. Maria and Carlos looked up as Javier kept stomping his feet, but they quickly forgot about him and returned their attention to the work in front of them. A new pig head came down the line about every 3 seconds, and there really wasn't time to make conversation. Javier had started this job 3 months earlier after moving all the way from Oaxaca, Mexico. Someone he knew from his hometown had moved here to Austin, Minnesota first, and then sent word back home to Mexico saying there were lots of good jobs here. And so, the town of Austin, Minnesota had now filled up with friends and relatives from the same area in Mexico. Javier and his wife, Anna, had decided to take a risk and follow all these people going to Minnesota. They'd packed up their entire lives and brought their 2 young kids. The freezing winter was a huge adjustment, and it was hard to be in a place where they didn't speak the same language, but Javier was learning English as quickly as he could, and for now he was lucky that most of his coworkers were Latino as well, so he could speak Spanish at work. And so Javier and Anna were quickly becoming part of a tight-knit Mexican community in Minnesota. Javier, who loved basketball, had even found a few friends to play pickup games with on the weekends when it was warm enough outside. And so all in all, Javier was happy with his new life in Minnesota. He was glad to have his job at the meatpacking plant, even though it was totally physically punishing. Everyone on the processing line did the same thing over and over and over again all day long. Javier knew that many of his coworkers suffered from repetitive motion injuries, such as carpal tunnel syndrome, which causes numbness, tingling, and pain in the hand and forearm. But on that cold December day, Javier tried not to focus on his aching, tingling limbs. There was a nurse on duty at the plant, but he didn't want to risk being sent home. He didn't have many sick days left, and he really needed the paycheck. His family needed winter clothes, and their expenses were much higher in Austin, Minnesota than they had been back in Mexico. So despite how horrible he felt, Javier remained in his place between Maria and Carlos at the end of the processing line. He turned his attention to the work in front of him and finished his shift before heading home. The next day, Javier woke up in his apartment, shivering under his blanket. Before he even opened his eyes, he realized that he still felt achy and his hands were still very tingly. And it was an odd sensation in his hands, almost like his hands belonged to someone else. As Javier pulled the blanket closer to his body, he immediately felt that same feverish chill that he'd had the previous day at the plant. Javier desperately just wanted to go back to sleep, but he knew he couldn't. He had to go to work. Javier finally opened his eyes and tried to swing his legs towards the edge of the bed, but nothing happened. His legs remained still. He tried to tense the muscles, but felt no response. With his heart racing, he sat up and grabbed at his thighs with his hands, and to Javier's horror, they just felt like dead weight. No matter what he did, he couldn't get his legs to move. Javier frantically yelled out that he couldn't feel his legs. His wife, Anna, rushed inside with a look of deep concern on her face. Cold sweat started dripping from Javier's brow as the realization of his situation sunk in. He told Anna that he needed to go to the hospital right now. The couple didn't have a car, so Anna called a taxi, and then she and their kids literally carried Javier from his bed to the cab. Javier did his best to keep a brave face on for his family, but when he looked over at his wife, he could tell how scared she was. When Javier and Anna arrived at the Austin Medical Center, which was just a few miles from their apartment, medical technicians lifted Javier onto a gurney and wheeled him into an exam room. A few minutes later, a doctor entered the room, followed by an interpreter who greeted Javier in Spanish and said her name was Carol. For the next few minutes, the doctor and Javier discussed his symptoms as Carol translated their statements. Finally, the doctor said something to Carol, and then the doctor left the room. Javier could hear him making a phone call from his office across the hallway. Carol leaned into Javier and explained that the doctor suspected that Javier had nerve damage, but he didn't know what had caused it, and the Austin Medical Center was not really equipped to treat it. The doctor had recommended that Javier be transferred to the Mayo Clinic, a larger medical center about 50 miles away in Rochester, Minnesota. He was making those arrangements now. Javier looked over at Anna as she squeezed his hand. He didn't want to go so far away from her and the kids, but he needed to get better so he could go back to work. Javier looked back at Carol and nodded. He would go to the Mayo Clinic. Two weeks later, Javier lay in a hospital bed at the Mayo Clinic, looking out the window at the falling snow. It was Christmas Day, and Javier wished he could be home celebrating with his family. He had spent the past 2 weeks having countless blood tests, being rolled in and out of MRI machines, and feeling needle pokes at his veins. But he didn't feel much better, and he still couldn't move his legs. The doctors explained that his spinal cord was severely inflamed, which was causing his symptoms. However, the doctor said that they still had no idea why, except that it had to do with Javier's own immune system. For some reason, it was attacking his own nerves instead of helping to keep him healthy. A nurse walked into the room and checked Javier's IV drip. Javier was being treated with steroids, which are powerful chemicals that reduce swelling in the human body. His doctors had promised Javier that steroids would bring some relief to his spinal cord, although they probably would not completely cure his mysterious ailment. Javier winced as he remembered the doctor who told him that he might spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. The thought of that filled Javier with dread. If he couldn't walk, then he would not be able to keep working at the meat processing plant. He would have no way to make a living for Anna and the kids, and he would become dead weight to his whole family. Javier thought that he and Anna had come too far and worked too hard to give up now. And so he looked down at his tingling legs, and with all his might, he tried to move them, and just then he saw he could wiggle his toes. Just a little. Wasn't much, but it was a start. Javier decided he would do everything he could to try to get back on his feet. As Javier was struggling to recover, Carol Hidalgo, the translator at the Austin Medical Center, walked into a small exam room with a doctor to help out a new patient. It was early in the spring of 2007, about 4 months after Javier had first been hospitalized, and Carol was always extremely busy. This area had a lot of Spanish-speaking residents, so she was constantly translating for the hospital's medical staff. It was tiring work, but Carol enjoyed it. She felt like she was a problem solver. The latest patient was a tired-looking man in his 40s who worked at the quality pork processors plant with Javier. The man, whose name was Carlos, the man who stood next to Javier on the processing line, rubbed his legs as he explained that he'd been feeling weak and experiencing tingling in his limbs for over a month now. Carol listened carefully and relayed his symptoms to the doctor. Carlos said that his right hip and thigh were throbbing, and it was as if the soles of his feet were on fire. At first, he thought he was just tired from standing all day long, but now he was having trouble walking. Carlos said that he barely had the energy to do his job, but he desperately needed the money. His family's trailer home had burned down in the winter, and he was putting in extra hours to try to afford the rent on their new home. Carol's heart broke for him. She saw a lot of patients like Carlos. They worked so hard in order to make a better life for their families, but it was often at their body's expense. Their bodies often broke down as a result of the grueling work. She translated his story for the doctor, who nodded and told Carol to let Carlos know she was going to examine his legs. And when she was done, she shook her head and said that she'd need to run more tests. Carlos's muscles seemed fine, and so the doctor suspected that his problems were actually a nerve issue. As the doctor was speaking, Carol frowned. Something about this sounded familiar, but she couldn't exactly place what it was. And anyways, she saw so many patients every single day that it really wasn't that surprising that people's symptoms kind of bleeded together and sounded similar. So Carol jotted down some notes, and then she shook Carlos's hand and told him she hoped that he would feel better soon. Carol followed the doctor out of the room. Austin Medical Center was very crowded that day, and Carol had another patient that she needed to help. In May of 2007, so about 5 months after Javier first got sick, Javier proudly walked back through the Quality Pork Processors plant doors with a huge smile on his face. For months, his family had survived on their tiny savings and the charity of friends and neighbors. His doctors still didn't know what had made him sick, but the steroid treatments had reduced the inflammation in his spinal cord, and with intense and very painful physical therapy, Javier had slowly learned to walk again, even though he did still need a cane for balance. But his doctors thought he was well enough to work again, and the plant had cleared him to come back. Javier yelled greetings to his coworkers, Maria and Carlos, over the very noisy machinery, and right away Javier noticed that they both looked very tired and were moving so stiffly. But there really wasn't time to talk. It was time to get back to work. Javier was the happiest he'd been since that horrible day in December when he first got sick. But despite the progress he had made, Javier still was not fully healed. While he had regained control of his legs, he had not regained control of his bladder. So he had to wear a catheter, a tube that collected his urine in a bag. The bag was taped to his leg under his pants, so it wouldn't be noticeable to anyone. Javier took a deep breath, stepped up to his old place in the assembly line, and got back to work. 3 weeks later, Javier sat on a bench outside the factory during his lunch break, resting in the sun. Since he had come back to work, the pain in his legs had returned. He knew his body wasn't as strong as it used to be, and he hoped it was just part of the healing process. As Javier tried to relax, Maria, the woman who worked with him on the processing line, walked over and eased down next to him. She groaned and rubbed her legs. She told Javier she had a knot in her calf that just wouldn't go away, and her arms were feeling so heavy. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she told Javier that her arms were so sore she could barely hold up the spoon to feed her baby daughter when she was at home. She said their colleague, Carlos, was struggling too, but he was trying to work through the pain. Suddenly, a whistle blew, which meant the lunch break was over. Javier watched as Maria slowly stood up and stretched, and then Javier tried to get up too, but suddenly his legs gave out from under him. He tried to stand up again, but his legs just wouldn't move. Javier told Maria to please go get help. He needed a doctor immediately. 3 months later, in September of 2007, Carol, the translator at Austin Medical Center, was in the emergency room helping a young woman named Maria, the same Maria who worked next to Javier at the QPP processing plant. Carol couldn't believe that Maria was sitting in a wheelchair. Just a few months earlier, she'd seen the young mother for another exam, and she seemed fine. Now, Maria could hardly stand up and needed help to get on the exam table, and when she tried to sign an authorization form, she couldn't even hold the pen. Maria said that it felt like her right arm had fallen asleep, and her feet were completely numb and tingling. A doctor came into the room and performed an examination. He tested Maria's reflexes and then arranged for additional blood tests. Then he had Carol tell Maria that he did have a diagnosis. Maria had a condition called neuropathy, which is a general term for nerve damage. It explained her weakness, numbness, and pain. He didn't know what was causing it, but he was still prescribing her steroids. After the doctor left, Carol, the translator, could see that Maria seemed unsure what to do. In a quiet voice, Maria told Carol that she was scared. A lot of her colleagues were getting sick too. One of them had even lost movement of his legs twice. Carol gave her a hug and promised her that the doctors would find an answer. Then she helped Maria back into her wheelchair and wheeled her to the elevator. After Maria left, Carol returned to the treatment area, deep in thought. Carol liked to write while she puzzled things out in her head. She sat in a chair and took out her notebook and a pen, and she watched people rush by in the hallway. She realized that she had translated for several patients over the past few months who all had very similar symptoms. There was Maria, who just a few months ago was walking, but now could barely move. And then there was Carlos, whose feet felt like they were burning. And then there was Javier, whose legs had stopped working altogether. She scribbled down the first thing that they had in common. They had all been diagnosed with a type of neuropathy. And so Carol wondered if maybe something else connected these patients. Carol knew that each of these patients had different doctors and nurses, and these doctors and nurses rarely talked about their patients to each other. As a translator, Carol might be the only person in the clinic who knew that these patients had been diagnosed with the same problems. Just then, Carol spotted the chair of general medicine, Dr. Richard Schindler, walk by in the hallway. Carol knew he valued the opinions of everyone on his staff. He always found the time to talk. Carol ran after him and asked if he had a moment to chat. He nodded and said that he did. Then Carol took a breath and she asked him, "What causes neuropathy?" Carol had heard the diagnosis before, but she'd never quite understood it. He smiled at her and said that one of the most common causes of neuropathy was diabetes. Carol shook her head. She knew that Javier didn't have diabetes, and neither did Carlos or Maria. Dr. Schindler then told her that neuropathy can also result from traumatic injuries, exposure to toxins, and from infections. Dr. Schindler asked Carol why she was interested, and she told him that she'd translated for at least 3 patients who were all diagnosed with neuropathy. Carol was almost certain they all worked at the same pork processing plant. She thought there might be more she had forgotten about, but she needed his help to get a better understanding of their diagnosis. Dr. Schindler's expression grew thoughtful, and he told Carol to please find him later and he would help her try to figure it out. And so, later that afternoon, Carol and Dr. Schindler sat down together and went over the files of every patient that had been diagnosed with neuropathy in the past year. Carol could see Dr. Schindler's face grow anxious as they sifted through the names and charts. By the end of the day, he and Carol had identified 6 different cases of neuropathy that all seemed to be linked. Not only did they all work at Quality Pork Processors, but they all worked in the same area of the processing line. Dr. Schindler thanked Carol for paying such close attention to the patients, and Carol told him that all she wanted was to figure out what was making them sick. She saw firsthand how much their jobs meant to them and their families. Carol just hoped that there was still time to help them before they became permanently paralyzed or worse. The next morning, after going through the patient files, Dr. Schindler picked up the phone to call the pork processing plant. He reached the factory's nurse and introduced himself and then explained the situation. He said several workers from her plant who were suffering from neuropathy had come to his clinic to be treated, and so now he needed to know if maybe other people who worked at this plant had maybe come to her with the same symptoms. He could hear the nurse pause for a moment, and then she said that she did remember some workers coming to her with tingling and soreness in their limbs, and she gave Dr. Schindler their names. He added them to the list of patients that he and Carol had already identified, making a total of more than 11 workers from this plant who all had similar symptoms. Dr. Schindler thanked the nurse for her help, and then they hung up. Clearly, there was something wrong at this pork processing plant, but the doctor didn't know what it was. He wondered if maybe workers were reacting to a vaccination, or maybe they had an infectious illness, or they'd been exposed to neurotoxic chemicals. He didn't know, but there was something there. Something was going on at this plant. Dr. Schindler realized that this could quickly turn into a huge medical investigation, one beyond the scope of just a small regional facility like the Austin, Minnesota Medical Center. And so the doctor sent out an email to Mayo Clinic, a much bigger clinic, which was where Javier had been treated. It was one of the best medical facilities in the state, and if anyone could help with this investigation that was about to start, it was them. Doctors at the Mayo Clinic quickly brought all 11 affected workers into their clinic one by one to test them for a long list of diseases and disorders. But all of the tests proved to be negative. Dr. Schindler reviewed the results with a growing sense of frustration. Within just a few months, these once healthy workers now had to use wheelchairs or had lost sensation in their arms, legs, or hands. It couldn't be a simple muscular disorder like carpal tunnel syndrome or any other repetitive stress injury. It wasn't a reaction to a vaccination, cancer, or a virus. It also was not a bacteria or a parasite. There had to be something happening at the pork processing plant, but no one at the Austin, Minnesota Medical Center or the Mayo Clinic could figure it out. Dr. Schindler realized that if he was going to get to the bottom of why people who worked at this plant were getting so sick, he would need more help. It was time to call the Minnesota Department of Health. On November 28, 2007, Around 2 months after Carol, the interpreter, realized that something at the plant was making all these people sick, Dr. Ruth Linfield, the Minnesota State epidemiologist, pulled her car into Quality Pork Processing's parking lot. At the same time, several other cars drove into the lot and parked right next to her. Dr. Linfield was there to lead an inspection of the meat processing line. She'd brought with her a delegation of 3 animal health experts, a medical detective, an infection control specialist, and a toxicologist. Whatever was causing the workers at this plant to get sick, Dr. Linfield and her team were confident they would figure out what it was. The company's CEO, a man named Kelly Wadding, along with the head of HR and the company nurse, stepped forward to greet their visitors and lead them into the factory. Dr. Linfield stepped into the entry with the rest of the team, and she pulled protective gear over her dark gray business suit. Plastic gloves, booties, masks, and plastic gowns. Then she followed the CEO, Kelly Wadding, out onto the factory floor, and the inspection began. First, the investigators were escorted through the entry room, where enormous pigs weighing about 250 pounds were stunned and then slaughtered. After the pigs were slaughtered, their blood was drained and their carcasses were thoroughly cleaned. From the entry room, the group moved into the section called the warm room, where the carcasses were hung by their rear legs and butchered into different parts. As the investigators followed the path of the pig carcasses around the warm room, Dr. Linfield and her team observed the tasks being performed at each workstation. Each worker made a particular cut in the hog carcass. Some used machinery, and others used large knives. It was messy and repetitive, but so far, Dr. Linfield hadn't seen anything that could cause an outbreak of disease. Finally, at a section near the end of the line, the group came to a large table. About 35 workers were gathered there, removing the last bit of meat from the hog using a specialized device. A pink mist hung over the table. Dr. Linfield stopped walking and looked down at her plastic white gown. She could see all these tiny pink particles settling on her arms, chest, and shoulders. Then she looked back at the assembly line and was horrified by what she was seeing. And within minutes, the company's CEO, Kelly Wadding, had shut the entire plant down. Dr. Linfield was looking at what quality pork processors called the head table, where workers literally took apart the pig's head piece by piece. They cut out the snout, the ears, tongues, cheeks, and jaws of each hog using knives, chisels, and automatic cutting tools. But the part of the process that horrified Dr. Linfield was the very last step, when workers removed the pig's brain. Like the rest of the pig's body, its brain is a marketable product. People in some parts of the world will use pig brain to thicken their stir-fry, while other people scramble pig brain in with eggs. But because the plant processed the pigs so rapidly, the plant needed an efficient, easy way to extract the brains from the pig's skulls. They came up with a unique method to get the brain out, which only a few other factories in the world had even tried. Under the company's unusual process, the brain removal workers were required to blast pressurized air into a hole in the pig's skull. And then the brain poured out of that same hole the air went in, now a gooey pink substance that kind of resembled Pepto-Bismol or a lumpy strawberry milkshake. And workers were blasting pig brains at an incredible speed, liquefying about 22 brains every minute. It was a gruesome process, to be sure, but what caught Dr. Linfield's attention was something else. It was the pink mist that hovered around the whole head table and then lightly coated the rest of the room thanks to the air currents from the fan above them. That pink mist was created by tiny particles of pig brain. The air gun that workers used to liquefy the brain was so strong that some of the brain became vaporized and basically floated up into the air. None of the workers wore any kind of breathing protection, such as respirators or face masks, so everyone in the room, but especially those who worked at the head table, and even more so the actual brain removal workers, were inhaling particles from 1,350 aerosolized pig brains every hour. Javier was a brain removal worker, and Carlos and Maria worked very close to his station. In fact, almost all the workers who got sick were stationed right near the brain removal machine. Dr. Linfield's team discovered that all of these workers were suffering from a brand new disease, which was given the name progressive inflammatory neuropathy. As a result of their massive exposure to aerosolized pig brain matter, their immune systems were constantly creating antibodies to neutralize the foreign proteins. But because these animal cells were very similar to human cells, the antibodies ended up attacking their own nerve cells as well, and over time, the disease could do enough damage to leave victims confined to a wheelchair. Kelly Wadding, the pork processing CEO, shut off the air gun as soon as Dr. Linfield pointed out all the pig brain particles floating in the air all around his employees. And then the CEO had that air gun hauled out of the factory on a trolley, never to return. And once that air gun was gone and the factory resumed work, the workers at the head table stopped getting sick. Javier would return to work a second time, but his body was so damaged that he could not actually handle the physical demands of the job. Javier's current state of health, the condition of his family, and his location are unknown. The same can be said for his co-workers, Maria and Carlos. As for the plant, they continue to process pork, slaughtering about 19,000 hogs every day. Morgantown, West Virginia is this beautiful place nestled at the bottom of this huge mountain range called the Green Mountains. It is a big-time college town, as the famous West Virginia University is located there, and so during the school year, the town is full of young people, and during the football season, the town is absolutely buzzing with excitement. But the college is not the only reason people live in Morgantown. Lots of families choose to live there because there's so much to do year-round. Also, it's relatively safe, and in general, it's an up-and-coming place with new shops and restaurants and museums popping up every single year. But despite all of that, Morgantown is also known for something absolutely terrible, and that is the story of Skylar Neese. In 2012, 16-year-old Skylar Neese was a sophomore in high school in Morgantown, West Virginia. She was a straight-A student, and she worked part-time at a Wendy's, which is a fast food restaurant chain, and by all accounts, she was extremely well-liked by her peers, her co-workers, and had many, many friends. She was the only child of Mary and David Neese, and they absolutely adored her. David, in particular, who was this big, burly man's man, he said that he spoiled his daughter rotten. The parents would say their daughter was full of love and life, and she was fiercely loyal, and at times she could be absolutely hilarious. One of Dave's fondest memories is when Skylar was a very young girl, he was home taking care of her by himself. And that morning, as he's looking after her, she asks him if he will participate in one of her trademark tea parties. And so David, the ever-dutiful father, walks over and says, "Of course, I'll participate in your tea party." And he sits down in this little tiny pink chair, and his daughter, who's got her ballerina tutu on, she's across the table and she's all smiles, and she sits down in her little pink chair, and she hands him this little plastic teacup. And so he takes the teacup and he sees there's water already inside of it. And so he sips the tea inside of the cup and he says, "Oh, it's so good, honey. You did such a good job brewing this tea." And Skylar is just blushing. She is so happy and so thrilled that he liked her tea. Later that night, when Mary came home from work, she goes to her husband, Dave, and says, "Hey, how did it go? How was it looking after Skylar today?" And Dave would tell her about all the things they did, including their big tea party. And he would tell Mary that, this time she actually put water inside of the teacup, so it was actually like a real tea party. And Mary stops him and goes, "Dave, Skylar's not tall enough to reach the faucet. How could she have put water inside of those cups?" And it turned out Skylar was using toilet water to fill the teacups. Fast forward to 2012, and on the night of July 5th, 16-year-old Skylar Neese had just finished a night shift at the Wendy's restaurant, and she just got home. She walks through the front door of her family's apartment, and as soon as she gets inside, she tells her parents she's really tired, she wants to go to bed. And so she hugged both of her parents, she told them that she loved them, and then Mary and Dave watched their daughter walk down the first floor hallway, and then they watched her open her bedroom door, go inside, and shut it behind her. The following morning, Mary and Dave both had to work, so they were up early, and Skylar was not up. She was still in her bedroom, her door was still shut, and so they assumed she was just going to sleep in. And so Mary and Dave, they make breakfast, they're chatting, they're kind of doing their morning routine, and then when it was time to go to work, they decided, let's not bother Skylar, she worked late last night, let her sleep in. And so the parents, they leave without seeing or talking to their daughter. Later that afternoon, Dave would come home early from work, and he gets to the apartment, he goes inside, and it's quiet. Now, Mary was still at work, But Skylar, at this point, really should not have been asleep. It's like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And so he's thinking, she's got to be up around here somewhere. And so he yells out to his daughter, hey, I'm home. Where are you? What are you up to? But there was no response. It was just silent. And so he walked down the first floor hallway towards his daughter's bedroom, and he saw the door was still shut. Now, she only kept that door shut when she was sleeping. And so he's thinking, okay, I guess she must still be asleep. This is really late in the afternoon. So, I'm going to knock on the door and see if she's okay. And so he knocks on the door and says, hey, Sky, it's late in the afternoon. You got to get up. But there was no answer. And when he listened to the door, there was no noise coming from the bedroom. And so he thought that was pretty weird. And so he knocked a few more times. He yelled out a few more times. And when there was no response, no answer, no sound, he opened the door up. And when he looked inside, Skylar was not in there. Now, Dave was thinking to himself, I don't think my daughter told me that she would be gone today, or at least not right now. And he's trying to think, did she say something? Was she meeting someone today? And he couldn't think of it. And so he just pulled his phone out and he called his daughter. But she didn't pick up. So he called his wife, Mary, and Mary's at work. And Mary picks up and Dave asked her, hey, have you seen Skylar, or do you know where she is right now? And she would say, no, I don't know where she is. Maybe she's out with one of her friends. And so after Dave hung up the phone with his wife, he wound up calling one of Skylar's very closest friends. Her name was Sheila, and she had known Skylar since they were in second grade. They were practically inseparable, and he had a good relationship with Sheila. And so he just calls Sheila and he says, hey, I haven't seen Skylar. She's gone right now. Do you know where she is? And Sheila would say, no, I'm sorry, I don't, but I did talk to her last night, but there was nothing unusual about our interaction. It was just normal texting about, normal stuff. And so Dave said, okay, thank you. Well, if you could, can you please try to get in touch with Skylar? And if you do get in touch with her, please tell her to get in touch with us. Or if you hear anything about her, please just let me know. After Dave hung up the phone with Sheila, he kind of stopped and just looked around his daughter's bedroom and thought, maybe there's some clue in here about where she's gone. And at first glance, really nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But when he walked around her bed and was looking inside of her closet, he saw the mesh screen that should have been mounted on the outside of her window was in her closet. And he's thinking, why is that in there? There's no reason for it to be in the closet. And so instinctively, he just turns around and walks over to the window that this screen is supposed to be on. And when he looks down at the bottom of the window, he sees it's open. Barely, just enough where you could maybe get your fingernails underneath the window and pry it open. And so Dave reaches down and opens this window all the way. And because there was no screen on this window, he just stuck his head all the way out the window. So his head is outside of the apartment. He's just kind of looking around, looking for some explanation of why this screen had been removed and put in her closet. And he got his explanation when he looked straight down and saw on the grass outside, just several feet below this window, because this is a first floor window, there was a bench, and the bench clearly had been moved there recently. For Dave, even though he had never heard of his daughter sneaking out of the house before and really didn't think that was something she would do, he's looking around thinking, okay, the evidence in her room and now outside of her room really indicates that that is exactly what she must have done the night before. She must have snuck out. But as he's processing this, he's also thinking, okay, well, if she snuck out of the house last night and then, snuck back into her room, why didn't she replace the screen on the window? And why didn't she close the window all the way? And then this morning, before she left to go wherever she went, why didn't she go outside and move the bench from under her window back to where it was supposed to go to avoid suspicion? Why didn't she do that? And then it dawns on him that his daughter must have snuck out the night before, but not come back yet. She's still out wherever she went. Dave was very concerned. However, he's thinking maybe there's a better explanation. Maybe I'm jumping to conclusions. Maybe she didn't sneak out. And so he calls his wife to kind of just talk with her and figure out what they should do. And they decide, you know what, this is concerning, but let's just give her a couple of hours to turn back up again. I'm sure she's fine. And so they begin to wait. And then at 4 p.m. that evening, Wendy's, the restaurant where Skylar worked, called Dave and said, hey, have you seen Skylar? She was supposed to work today and she didn't show up. She didn't call. It's very unlike her. What's going on? And this was the tipping point. Dave and Mary knew something had to be wrong, and so Dave called the police.
Long County 911, do you have an emergency?
I have a 16-year-old daughter who apparently snuck out of her room last night. She has not been home, hasn't went to work, can't get a hold of her from any of her friends. I am scared to death.
Has she done this before?
No.
After Dave got off the phone, he and his wife began kind of frantically figuring out what they should do. While the police are out looking, should we go out and look too? Or should we stay here in case she comes home and, maybe she's hurt, maybe we can help her if she gets here. And so they're having this really difficult and stressful conversation when Mary's phone rings and it's Sheila. And so Mary immediately answers it, hoping for some good news about her daughter. But Sheila asks Mary right away, hey, has Skylar come home yet? And Mary says, no, she hasn't. And in fact, we just got off the phone with the police because this doesn't make sense. Something's wrong and we're getting the police involved. And so when Sheila hears this, she kind of takes a deep breath. And then after a little bit of a hesitation, she says, Mary, I gotta tell you the truth about last night. She would go on to explain that the night before, Skylar had snuck out of the house, and so had she, along with their other very close friend named Rachel. And Rachel was someone that Mary and Dave also knew very, very well. The three girls were kind of like best friends and totally inseparable. And so Sheila said the three of them snuck out, and in fact, they did this a lot, and they would drive around town and smoke marijuana together. But this was not the big reveal. Despite this being fairly shocking to Mary and Dave, this was not the big reveal. The big reveal was that when they went out and snuck out of their houses and smoked weed together, they would make sure they never drove their car. Whoever was driving would never drive directly in front of any of their houses because they were concerned that the noise from the car could wake up parents and then they'd get caught. And so the way they would do it is after they snuck out of their house, they would walk a block or two away from their house and then they would call or text the other two and they'd get picked up and they'd go do their thing. And then when they got dropped off, they would get dropped off a block or two away from their home and then walk the rest of the way. And so Sheila told Mary that last night, like so many other nights, she dropped Skylar off about a block away from their apartment, and then Sheila and Rachel drove off. So they did not actually see Skylar enter her apartment. So they don't know for sure if she actually made it home okay. And so this was obviously horrifying for Mary and Dave to hear because it totally opened the door for their daughter to have been abducted during this walk from the drop-off point back to her apartment. And the street she was on was not well lit. It's the middle of the night. It's dark. She's potentially high on marijuana. And so it seemed like that was a very realistic thing that could have happened, as horrifying as it sounded. And so after Mary got off the phone with Sheila, she called the police and she updated them about what Sheila had told her. And then Mary and Dave met up with Sheila and Sheila's mother and began searching the immediate area around their apartment in hopes that maybe, she fell somewhere and she's trapped and she just needs to be picked up or helped in some way. But after searching for several hours and knocking on dozens and dozens of doors, nobody saw anything, nobody knew anything, there was no sign of Skylar. And so as this group is totally down, they don't know what to do, they feel totally helpless, they know the police are out looking for Skylar, but they want to do something and they don't know what to do. And that's when Mary remembers there is a security camera on the outside of their apartment building that is looking down at the road. And so right away, the four of them literally run back to the apartment building. They go inside, they find the security manager, they explain the situation, and sure enough, he pulls up the footage from the night before, and the footage they see doesn't make sense. Sheila had dropped Skylar off on that corner, kind of out of view of the camera at around midnight. But at 12:30, so 30 minutes after she's been dropped off, you see this unknown kind of generic looking car pull up right in front of the apartment complex. And then Skylar comes running across the lawn, goes right up to the car, opens the back door, hops in the back seat, shuts it, and the car drives off. Even though this did not solve the mystery of where their daughter was, because they had no idea what car this was, who was driving it, or where they were going, Mary and Dave still felt relieved because from their perspective, it seemed like their daughter had willingly got into this vehicle. Whoever it was, whatever they were doing, she had gotten in on purpose, which meant she probably was not being abducted, which was their big fear. Over the next couple of days, the police analyzed this footage and tried to get information about this car, but the footage was so grainy, they couldn't do it. However, the police were telling Dave and Mary, hey guys, I'm sure Skylar is going to show up up any day now. You know, as much as you may not want to believe it, that your daughter is capable of running away, it is fairly common for teens to do that. They'll run away and then, you know, a couple days later, they'll pop back up. And so I'm sure that's what's going on with Skylar. You know, she chose to get in that car, and so I'm sure she will choose to get back in touch when she feels comfortable. So a couple of days go by and the parents haven't heard anything from their daughter, and then a couple of weeks go by, still nothing, and then a couple of months go by, still nothing. And this is all despite the fact that there is a massive search happening led by the police, and locals in Morgantown have put flyers up everywhere that have pictures of Skylar Neese's face everywhere in town and in neighboring towns. It was like you could not go 5 feet without being reminded that this girl is missing. Have you seen her? If you have, give us information. Despite the amount of publicity this case was getting, no one came forward with any meaningful information. It was like Skylar had just vanished and no one had a clue what happened to her. Her parents were obviously devastated that they had no idea what happened to her, but they were kind of holding on to this idea that, you know, maybe she did run away and maybe she will eventually be in touch with us. But by December of that year, so 6 months after Skylar had gone missing, no one had heard from her, no one had seen her, no one had any idea where she was, there was no new leads. And so people were starting to feel less and less optimistic, and the case was starting to kind of go cold. And then on December 12th, something totally unexpected happened that changed everything. On that night, Rachel, the other friend who had been there with Sheila and with Skylar on the night that Skylar had vanished, she has a full-blown nervous breakdown. In fact, it's so bad that she's screaming and running around and she's punching her family members, and her mom actually calls the police on her.
I have an issue with a 16-year-old daughter of mine. I can't control her anymore. She's screaming. She's running through the neighborhood. Give me the phone. No, this is over. This is over. Hurry up. Oh, God. She just gave me a block. Oh, God. Hurry up, please.
After this call was made, the police show up to Rachel's house and they take her away to a psychiatric hospital. And then several days later, when she was released from that hospital, she went straight to the Morgantown Police Department. She walked inside and said, "I got to get something off my chest about Skylar." Apparently, whatever it was that she had been keeping secret had just been too difficult to keep inside. It was quite literally driving her crazy. And so the police said, "Okay, great." And they brought her into an interview room. They sat down and they said, "Okay, what do you got for us?" The following has been pulled from what Rachel told police. Back on July 5th, 2012, Skylar came home from that night shift at Wendy's. She goes inside her family's apartment. She says goodnight to her mom and dad. She goes into her bedroom and she shuts the door, and she's laying on her bed. She's on her phone. She's not going to bed quite yet. And as she's laying there, she starts getting text messages from Rachel and also from Sheila asking her if she wants to sneak out that night. Now, Skylar didn't want to, and she said as much because she was actually hurting. She was mad at her two friends. According to some of her other friends that went to school with her and Rachel and Sheila, the three of them were totally inseparable, but lately, kind of the few months leading up to when she ultimately disappeared, there had been tension in their group. It seemed like Sheila and Rachel were getting very, very close and kind of pushing Skylar away, and Skylar was starting to pick up on it. It was little things like Sheila and Rachel would show up to school in matching outfits, but they wouldn't tell Skylar beforehand, kind of leaving her out. Or whenever they posted selfies of the three of them, Skylar was always relegated to the back or kind of in some other way obscured to make sure she was not the focal point of the picture. It was just very obvious that they were deprioritizing Skylar, and it was really hurting Skylar's feelings. And so it seemed like her way of standing up to them and kind of telling them that she was upset was to turn down their offer of sneaking out and smoking weed with them. But over the next couple of hours, Skylar would eventually say, "Okay, fine, I'll come with you guys. I'll sneak out and we'll go smoke together." Just before 12:30 a.m. on July 6th, Skylar gets off of her bed. She walks over to her window. She lifts it up and she pulls the screen off, and she walks over to her closet. She puts the screen in her closet and shuts the door to the closet. And then she walks back over to the window and crawls out and lowers herself down onto the grass below. And then she walks over and grabs the bench and slides it over and puts it right underneath her window. And then she stands on the bench and reaches up and pulls the window down so there's just a little crack left so she can get back inside. And then she just waited by the side of the apartment looking out towards the road. And right after 12:30, this car, the unknown car on the surveillance camera, pulls right in front of the apartment building, and Skylar runs over to it, opens up the back right door, and climbs inside. This unknown car was Sheila's car. Sheila was driving, and Rachel was in the front passenger seat. It would turn out Rachel and Sheila lied about basically everything, including what time they picked up Skylar. So the three girls, they drive away from Skylar's apartment, and Sheila hops on a highway and starts driving northwest. Now, the girls did not immediately start smoking inside of the car. They decided instead they would actually drive to a location, get out, and smoke there. And the place they decided on was a spot they had smoked at before. It was a known hangout spot for teenagers. It was located about 45 minutes away, just barely across the border into Pennsylvania. It was down this kind of old country road that nobody ever went on. And so Sheila drives the car 45 minutes. She crosses into Pennsylvania. She finds the turn onto this old road. They drive down it a little ways until they're pretty far away from the highway, at which point Sheila pulls off the road onto the grass, parks the car. The three girls get out and they walk past the car a little ways down the path to a clearing on the right. There was a hill that went up on the right, and they would kind of sit on this hill looking downhill, and that would be where they would smoke. And so the three girls, they sit down, they're all next to each other facing downhill. They're not facing each other. And Sheila, who is sitting all the way to the right with the car being over to the left, she pulls out the marijuana joint and she's about to light it, but she realizes she does not have a lighter. And so she asks Rachel and Skylar if they have a lighter, and they both pat themselves down. They're checking themselves. They don't have a lighter. And then Sheila says to Skylar, who's all the way to the left of the way they're sitting, so Skylar is closest to the car, she asks Skylar, hey, can you go in the car and get the lighter that I know is in there? And Skylar said, no problem. So Skylar, she stands up and she turns. Her back is to her two friends. And as soon as she starts walking, what she would have heard is the sound of her two friends standing up as well, and then loudly saying, 1, 2, 3. And on 3, Skylar would have felt two knives being plunged into her back by Rachel and by Sheila. In a panic, Skylar does not even turn around. She just starts taking off running towards the car, and she manages to run away from her attackers. But because of her grievous injuries in her back, she eventually slows down, at which point Sheila tackles her from behind. She gets her on the ground, she pins her on her back, and Sheila is trying to stab Skylar, but Skylar is doing her best to keep the knife off of her. But at some point, Rachel comes running up beside them, and between Rachel and Sheila, they manage to hold Skylar's hands down, at which point Sheila and Rachel began taking turns stabbing her in the chest and in the neck. The whole time, Skylar is trying to defend herself, but it's impossible with these two on top of her. And at some point, she just kind of gives up and she says, why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this to me? But they don't give her a reason. They just keep on going. And eventually, Rachel stops stabbing Skylar, but Sheila doesn't. Sheila keeps on going until, quote, her neck stopped making gurgling sounds. And then once Skylar went still, Sheila stood up like it was nothing, and she and Rachel just walked away from her body back to the car. They went around to the trunk of the car, they opened it up, and inside was shovels, bleach, trash bags, rags. They had brought along a kill kit because they knew what they were going to do this night. And so they start by cleaning themselves off. They get the blood off of them and off of their weapons, and then they take the shovels and they walk a little ways off of the road, kind of into the woods, and they try to dig a grave, but it would turn out the ground was too hard. And so they abandon the grave idea and just grab Skylar's lifeless body and drag it just about 6 feet off of the road and kind of chuck it against a log. And then they threw boulders and sticks and anything they could on top of her body. They don't know if she's still alive at this point, so they're potentially dealing the fatal blow with these rocks and logs. They cover her up until she's totally obscured. And then the two girls just walk back up. They grab their shovels, they grab their rags, their bleach, they put it back in the trunk, they hop in their car, and they drive away. It would turn out Rachel and Sheila had been planning this for months. The reason? They didn't like Skylar anymore, and apparently it wasn't enough to just be mean to her and not include her in things. They actually needed to kill her. And so the entire night that they went out and snuck out, that was all planned. They knew Skylar did not want to come out and sneak out with them because they knew she was upset with them. And so they said whatever they had to say to convince her to leave her house and sneak out with them. And so she did. She snuck out. And when she got in that car, Sheila and Rachel had their knives already in their front pocket of their sweatshirt. t-shirt ready to go. And on their ride to this spot in Pennsylvania, Sheila and Rachel acted like, oh, let's just go to this spot and smoke, when in reality, this was planned too. They wanted to make sure they were far away from Morgantown when they killed Skylar. And so when they got there and they walked down to their spot to actually begin smoking, Sheila and Rachel had intentionally not brought lighters, and Sheila had left a lighter in the car specifically so she could ask Skylar to go get it. Because the plan was, as soon as Skylar gets up to get that lighter and her back is to us, Sheila and Rachel had promised each other that they would count to 3 and then attack her. Ultimately, Rachel would be sentenced to 30 years in prison, but she'll be eligible for parole in 2023. And Sheila would be sentenced to life in prison, but she would also be eligible for parole in 2028. During their trials, Rachel was very remorseful and even gave an apology to Skylar's parents during the sentencing phase. Sheila, on the other hand, smirked during her trial for most of the time. She was smiling and totally making light of it. She said she didn't do it. She was totally not remorseful, and she did not offer an apology to Skylar's parents. She did, however, leave an unbelievably cruel message on Twitter. In March of 2013, when the police came out and officially said, we have identified the remains in the forest in Pennsylvania as belonging to Skylar Neese, when that announcement was made, just a couple of days later, Sheila tweeted, we really did go on 3. Sheila was arrested 1 month later.